your shield. Lieutenant Menenka Trevor had seldom felt quite so young. She climbed out of the hover cab which had delivered her to Fort Merritt and made herself stop and stretch thoroughly. She was a slender, fine-boned young woman, but the cramped passenger compartment of the small cab she'd been able to afford hadn't been designed to transport baggage as well as people. She'd made the entire flight from Nike Field to Fort Merritt with her duffel bag and footlocker piled on top of her legs. Besides, stretching out the kinks gave her an obvious reason to stand in place, gazing out over what she could see of the Merritt Reservation. The sprawling military base, named for one of the Dinochrome Brigade's fallen heroes, stretched as far as the unaided human eye could see. Most of its visible structures were low-lying, mere swells of ceramicrete rising like enormous half-buried golf balls from the surrounding tropical vegetation. There were a few exceptions. One of them, judging by the signs in front of it, was the fort's primary administration block. That particular structure was close to 30 stories tall and crowned with a bewilderingly complex clutter of communication arrays. Menenka wondered if it had been built so much taller than the base's other buildings, specifically to make the very youthful officers, reporting for their first field assignments, to feel even more nervous, or if that had been simply an unanticipated bit of serendipity. Her mouth twitched in a wry little smile at the trend of her own thoughts, and she stopped stretching, tugged at the hem of her uniform tunic back down, and activated her baggage hand unit. The footlocker and duffel bag floated out of the cramped cab and arranged themselves in neat formation behind her on their individual counter-grav units. She'd already paid the fare, and the cab's AI called the cheerful "Have a nice day" after her before it zipped its doors shut, pivoted, and went whining back down towards Nike Field. Menenka squared her shoulders and advanced along the seemingly endless ceramicrete walkway toward the admin's imposing front entrance with her baggage tagging obediently along behind her. Mirrored armor plast towered above her, reflecting the deep-toned blue sky and brilliant white clouds of Santa Cruz. The day was only moderately warm for early summer on Santa Cruz, but Menenka had been born and raised among craggy peaks of the planet Everest. She'd preferred a cooler, drier climate, not to mention a considerably lower atmospheric pressure. Although her brigade uniform's smart fabric maintained her body temperature in the range she'd selected, she felt sweat beading her forehead and gathering under her short, dark hair. At least Everest wasn't so far to the human-occupied norm that its citizens couldn't adjust to even the sweltering, humid sweat boxes like Santa Cruz if they had to. Eventually. At least her genetic heritage meant she tanned quickly and deeply. Of course, she admitted to herself, the climate isn't the only reason you're sweating today, now is it, Menenka? She chuckled quietly at the thought, then donned her official game face as she approached the sidearm-equipped sentry. The impeccably uniformed brigade corporal stood at a comfortable parade rest, impassively watching her approach. His presence, Menenka knew, was a complete anachronism. Far more effective security systems guarded the perimeter and buildings of Fort Merritt, and a standard computer interface would have been more efficient at greeting visitors and directing them to their appropriate destinations. Yet, the corporal's assignment here carried with it a message that it was not lost on the shiny new lieutenant. However good the technology, however lethal and dedicated the units of the Dinochrome Brigade might be, human command authority was engineered into it at every level. Ultimately, the brigade's Bolos were humanity's servants. Protectors as well, yes, and trusted battle companions. But in the end, human authority must be preserved at all levels. The corporal came to attention and saluted as Menenka stopped in front of him. She returned the salute smartly and read his nameplate as she did so. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How may I assist the lieutenant?" "Good afternoon, Corporal Morales. I'm reporting for the assignment to the 39th Battalion. My orders are to report to this battalion CO's office in the admin building." "I see. May I see the lieutenant's orders?" "Of course." Menenka handed across the chip folio containing not only her duty assignment orders, but also all of the movement orders and transportation vouchers it had taken to get her here from Sandhurst system. Corporal Morales flipped quickly to her assignment orders and slipped the relevant chip into his waistband mini-comp, then twiddled his fingers briefly on the virtual keyboard. From her perspective, Menenka couldn't make out the details of the holodisplay micro-comp projected in front of Morales' eyes, but the corporal obviously found what he's looking for quickly. Thank you, ma'am, he said, snapping the chip out of the microcomp and restoring it to its proper storage slot, before he handed the entire folio back to Manenka. The lieutenant will find Colonel Tchaikovsky's office in the 15th floor, number 1532. Take the center grav lift, turn right at the 15th floor landing, and continue along the end of the corridor. Thank you, Corporal Morales. Could you tell me if there's someplace I could check my baggage while I report in? Yes, ma'am. Press the housekeeping button on the building console. It's located to your right, just inside the entrance. Thank you, Manenka repeated, and the corporal nodded, came back to attention, and saluted her once more. She returned the courtesy and stepped past him into the admin building. Building console was right where Morales had indicated. Manenka punched up housekeeping. How may I assist you, Lieutenant Trevor? A pleasant voice asked, speaking through brigade transceiver surgically implanted into Manenka's left mastoid. I need to put my baggage into temporary storage while I report in. Of course. One moment, please. Manenka watched as her floating baggage twitched slightly. The building's artificial intelligence had automatically and instantly identified her from the IFF code programmed into her implanted brigade communication system. It took the computer a few more seconds to derive the proper command channel frequencies and codes from her baggage hand unit, which had been a civilian purchase, but it was more than equal to the challenge, and Manenka stood back as the footlocker and duffel went gliding smoothly away down a side passage. Your baggage will be stored pending your return, Lieutenant Trevor. Just press the recall button on your hand unit when you wish to reclaim it, the AI assured her. Do I have to return here for that? No, Lieutenant Trevor. It may take somewhat longer to read it to you, but you may recall it from any point inside the admin building. Thank you. You are most welcome, the AI replied, and Manenka walked across the lobby toward the grav lifts. She rather doubted the computer building's AI was a fully developed personality. One thing any brigade officer, even one as shiny and new-minted as she was, understood was the combined expense and complexity of the advanced psychotronics which gave a Bolo complete, autonomous, and functional personalities as complex as any human being. But AIs which lacked in full personalities carried programming which recognized and responded to courtesy. An automatic consideration for the emotions of electronic individuals was an excellent habit for a brigade officer to develop. The grav lift delivered her to the 15th floor with its customary disorienting speed and efficiency. Mindful of Morales' instructions, she turned to the right and quickly picked up the wall signage directing her towards the office of the commanding officer, 39th Battalion, Dinochrome Brigade. The sight of those words sent a sudden bright shiver through her. It was so close now, so close. She drew a deep breath, ordered herself to project an aura of calm, and walked briskly down the corridor. Colonel Everard Tchaikovsky had not only discovered years ago that if he kept his computer's holodisplay adjusted to exactly the right angle and height, he not only eased the strain of long hours spent in front of it imposed upon his neck, but permitted him to look directly through it at the door of his office, while obviously keeping his attention focused on his routine paperwork. Now, he let his eyes appear to linger on an absolutely fascinating breakdown of the most recent squabble between the Central Depot Maintenance and the battalion's chief armorer, while he actually studied the young woman's Staff Sergeant Schumer had ushered into his office. The young woman in question stood at parade rest, waiting with every outward sign of patience for him to notice her arrival. She was small, he thought, no more than 155 or 160 centimeters tall, and so slender he was tempted to think of her as delicate. Her cobalt blue eyes, set in an oval face with high cheekbones, a determined-looking, high-arched nose, and slightly pouty lips made an intriguing contrast with her very dark black hair and sandalwood complexion. They had a pronounced epicanthic fold, as well as those eyes, he noticed, and wondered exactly which strains of humanity's zestfully bubbling genetic stew had produced her. He quirked an index finger, touching a function key on his virtual keyboard, and the logistical report disappeared, replaced by the concisely encapsulated abstract from Lieutenant Trevor's records Sergeant Schumer had prepared and uploaded for him. She graduated 32nd out of an academy class of 1115, he noticed, top of her class in tactics, bottom third in psychotronic theory, substantially and regularly above average in all of her other courses, and ranked 14th in military history. 40-plus standard years in the brigade had taught Everard Tarkovsky's face to wear whatever expression he told it to, and so he managed to avoid any dramatic widening of his eyes or pursing of his lips, nor did he want to stand to and applaud her arrival. She was certainly impressive on paper, although he had his reservations about her apparent weakness in psychotronics. But he'd seen quite a few past cadets who looked impressive on paper and never lived up to that apparent promise in the field. "Lieutenant Minenka Trevor, reporting for duty, sir," she said, snapping to full attention and saluting sharply. Her standard English had an interesting accent which gave a throaty, almost smoky edge even to a crisp formal military phraseology, he noticed. He felt certain that a hint of soprano sensuality was both unconscious and unintentional, and he hid a mental grin as he contemplated how testosterone-challenged young bucks were likely to respond to it. "Stand easy, Lieutenant," he said, returning her academy-sharp salute rather more casually. She dropped back into parade rest rather than full stand-easy position, her eyes gazing a regulation 15 centimeters above his head. "So, you're our new Bolo commander," he said. Minenka's eyes popped wide against her will, till they dropped to Colonel Tarkovsky's face. Bolo commander? Surely she must have misheard him. He simply sat there, gazing back at her with a mildly speculative expression, and she fought an urge to lick her lips nervously as she realized he was preparing to go right on doing it until she said something. "Sir, my orders were report to Fort Merritt for duty with the 39th Battalion. Exactly what those duties were wasn't specified. However, I was certainly never anticipated that someone as junior and inexperienced as myself might be considered for assignment as a commander." "So, you think you're not up for the job then?" Tarkovsky let a deliberate edge of challenging coolness in his voice, but the young woman's composure remained unruffled. "Yes, sir, I believe I'm up to the job. I believe my academy record demonstrates that I have the training and the native ability to command a bolo in combat. I am also, however, as I said, very junior and aware of my inexperience. I'd anticipated an assignment to an additional training with hands-on experience under the tutelage of a fully qualified and experienced unit commander. At least that's what I was led to expect by my instructors at the academy." "I see." Tchaikovsky cocked back in his chair, propped his elbow on the chair arms, and steepled his fingers in front of his chest. He considered her coolly for several seconds, then allowed the first millimetric hint of a smile to show. "Not a bad answer, Lieutenant, and I'm sure that's exactly what the Academy type told you to expect. But, truth is, the brigade is experiencing some changes just now." Minenka's eyes darkened. She knew exactly to what he was referring to. The Melkonian Empire isn't as technologically advanced as the Concordiat, or at least not in most areas. They do remarkably well in electronic warfare and stealth capabilities, but they're far, far behind us in cybernetics, and they've demonstrated no equivalent to our own psychotronic technology. Unfortunately, the Empire is also much larger than the Concordiat. We knew that. What I strongly suspect none of our analysts considered was that we might be underestimating how much larger it might be. And now that we're busy killing each other in planet-sized lots, that particular question takes on a certain burning relevance. He looked at her levelly, and neither of them needed for him to be more specific. The current war against the Melkonian Empire had begun in 3343, the same year Minenka was born. Everyone had seen it coming. No one had even begun to imagine how terrible it would be once it began. The sheer stupendous size of the Empire had taken the Concordiat's so-called intelligence experts completely by surprise. On the other hand, the Concordiat's technological superiority must have come just as a great a surprise to the Melkonians. The initial naval engagements had gone overwhelmingly in humanity's favor, until, at least, the puppies had mobilized their real battle fleet. After that, things had gotten progressively uglier. 6 years ago, after 15 years of increasingly bloody warfare, the Melkonians had carried out what the Emperor had been pleased to call a demonstration strike on the planet of New Vermont. None of the planet's billion inhabitants had survived. The Concordiat's inevitable retaliatory strike on the Melkonian planet of Tharnas had been equally effective. But instead of inspiring the Melkonians to renounce its genocidal attacks, the Tharnash strike had become simply the first human contribution to an ever upward spiraling cycle of murderous violence. By now, under the grimly appropriate Plan Ragnarok, the extermination of the Melkonian ability to ever wage war again, which everyone knew, whether they would admit it or not, meant the effective extermination of the Melkonian species, had become the official policy of the Concordiat, as, self-evidently, the extermination of humanity had become the reciprocal policy of the Melkonian Empire. For Manenka, at this point, that was still an intellectual awareness. For Tchaikovsky, it wasn't. Manenka was aware, though she really wasn't supposed to be, that Tchaikovsky's last post before giving the 39th had been the executive officer of the 721st, which had taken 66% casualties at the Battle of Maybach. It's obvious that we have a significant advantage in combat power on a ton-for-ton basis. Their warships need a 3-to-1 advantage to meet us in an even footing, and the differential is even worse for their planetary heavy combat units going up against modern Bolos. The problem is that they appear to have this numerical advantage, and probably quite a good bit to spare. I take it you're already aware of most of this? Yes, sir, she said quietly. Then you realize the brigade is going to take heavy casualties in this war. In addition, we're expanding our strength at the highest rate in the brigade's history. That, of course, is why your academy curriculum was shortened by a full semester, and why your graduating class was 20% larger than the one before it, and 20% smaller than the one behind it, despite how difficult it is to find officer candidates capable of passing brigade screening. It's also why the 39th has been systematically rated for experienced commanders. We're running at a full stretch and beyond, frankly, to keep up with combat losses and simultaneously crew the new build Bolos. So while I would prefer to assign you to an experienced commander in the traditional mentor relationship, it simply isn't practical. In fact, of the 39th's 12 Bolo commanders, only 3, including myself, have seen actual combat. You'll be our youngest and most junior commander. I'm giving you 862 BNJ, Benji, as your Bolo. He's been around the block more than a few times, Lieutenant. You can learn a lot from him, just as you'd better be learning from everyone else around you. I'm sure you and your classmates at the academy worked on math of your odds surviving to retire, assuming anyone is allowed to retire in the foreseeable future, of course. If you did the math, then you know your odds aren't especially encouraging. Recognizing that will probably contribute to a realistic perspective, but don't fixate on it. That sort of thing can create a self-fulfilling prophecy situation. Instead, remember this, Lieutenant. Every single thing you can learn here, every trick you can pick up, every tactical insight, every speck of deviousness you can acquire will probably shift the probabilities in your favor. It will also make you a more effective commander, more dangerous to the enemy, and for right now, that's your entire responsibility, to learn how to survive, how to meet the enemy, how to defeat him. A Mark 28 Bolo like Benji is too long in the tooth for frontline deployment in a war like this. He's been around for 1 1/4 standard centuries, over 125 years, Lieutenant. He's picked up quite a few tricks in that time. Learn from him. Yes, sir, I'll try. Don't try, Lieutenant. Do. He held her eyes for another few moments, then nodded briskly. Very well, Lieutenant Trevor. Welcome to the 39th. He stood and shook her hand briefly but firmly. Then he nodded his head at the door. Sergeant Schumer will have your formal ordered ship assigning you to Benji. Major Fredericks is out on maneuvers at the moment, so the sergeant will probably turn you over to Sergeant Tobias. He's your company's senior Bolo tech. That makes him the best man to introduce you to Benji. Anyway, good luck, Lieutenant. He straightened up, and she came back to attention and saluted. He returned it. Dismissed, Lieutenant.